awesome festival? I find that it's just amazing, 10 years.
I'm amazed.
Yeah, I'm amazed. Well, to put on a festival for 10 years takes so much coordination and energy from so many people. But the one thing that it takes, I think, in addition to that, or even more than that, is a receptive audience. So I would like for you to give yourselves an applause, because Newburyport has embraced this from day one, and you couldn't do it just everywhere. And where can we do it? Right here. So thank you very much. We just have a few thank yous to get through before we turn it over to Jen and she introduces the stars of the show. The two banks, the local banks, the 5-cent Savings Bank and the Institution for Savings, have been with us for 10 years and got us off the ground, that's for sure. And then we have a number of local foundations. Some of them like to be celebrated. Some of them would just as soon not be. So the one organization that I will mention is the Rotary Club of Memphis, of Newburyport. I don't know what kind of slip that is, but anyway, we won't go there. And then the other group of people who have been, some of them have been with us for 10 years and some of them brand new, but the volunteers who work and do everything, all of the things that are coordinated as you walk through the day tomorrow have been done by volunteers. And so I'd like to give them a round of applause. And then finally, the steering committee is the real brains of this organization. And so if you're on the steering committee, just raise your hand and say, I'm on it and I'm really cute. Okay, so now it's Jen's turn. I'm going to shut up. We'll see how well that goes.
All right, well, I guess let's switch places.
All right, Jen.
All right, well, before I get started, there are two things I need to say. The first is that there are emergency exits in the back of the auditorium. And the second is, if you have cell phones with you, please put them on silence. So those are the two mandatory things I needed to say. Was that all right? Well, the topic tonight is the map thief. It's the story of an infamous crime. Oh, somebody's turning off the cell phone. I heard that. It's the story of an infamous crime, a revered map dealer with an unsavory secret, and the ruthless subculture that consumed him. Please welcome best-selling author, journalist, historian, Michael Blanding, and he will be in conversation with Dyke Hendrickson, a veteran reporter, now with the Daily News.
Well, we're pleased to have Michael with us tonight. This is the 10th anniversary, as you know, and it's one that honors fiction, nonfiction and history. And as it turns out, the book that he wrote is nonfiction, and it has a historical theme. Not ancient maps, but maps from the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries were stolen by E. Forbes Smiley III. And we'll talk more about that, but I think that what makes it fit tonight is that it's nonfiction, and it also looks at the arena of maps and history as that situation goes. Michael is a journalist, he's a magazine writer, he's a fellow at Brandeis University, and these are some of the things we're going to go into. And I think this will be interesting. We'll talk about his work and the book. Now, as a veteran journalist, I've covered many of these things, and the thing I always hated to hear from the moderator was, well, if there's any time at the end, we'll try to have some questions. But we're going to make time. We're going to have a lot of questions, and I'd like everyone to be thinking of some, because this is an engaged audience, and I'm interested in the subject, and I'm sure there'll be some thoughts that you'll want to bring forth. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, Michael, is, in terms of getting started on the book, how did you learn about the map thief? Was it a journalism story that you got involved in, or just how did you start the project?
Yeah, I remember first hearing about this crime when it happened around 2005, when Forbes Smiley was caught dropping an X-Acto knife blade at the Yale University Library. A librarian actually found it, and that started this whole unraveling of this crime that eventually he admitted to stealing almost 100 maps from these libraries. And I remember at the time, I've always been a map lover. For years, friends and family have known that a safe bet for a Christmas present is to get me an atlas or a book on maps. And so it always kind of stuck with me over the years. And then around 2011, I heard that he had gotten out of prison, and no one had ever talked to him before. And so I thought that I was going to do an article for Boston Magazine and kind of go back over the crime and tell the whole tale from start to finish. And I talked to one of his friends, and he said, I bet I can get this guy to talk to you. I bet I can, he's ready to talk now. And I went out to Martha's Vineyard and sat across a picnic table from him for about 4 hours. And by the end of that conversation, I was convinced that I didn't have a magazine article, that I had a book here. It was just so fascinating. There were so many elements, as you say, of history and the strange psychology of this really interesting character at the center of it. And
well, he did have a propensity for falsehood, because I was reading your book, and at one point you had asked him to explain the knife blade, the razor blade in his pants, and he said, well, I always carry it around, but I would never use it. So I'm thinking, oh, right, we all carry razor blades around. We all wear tweed jackets in July, and it fell out of a tweed jacket. So I think by one small example, you were able to point out that he didn't always tell the truth. In terms of your route to a book contract, tell us a little about early writing that you did, and perhaps maybe you met an agent, or just how did it unroll that you were able to get a book contract? Sure,
yeah. This is actually my second book. My first book is called The Coke Machine, and it's sort of a history of the Coca-Cola Company and the dark side of the Coca-Cola Company, looking at health and human rights issues around the world. And that came out of an article that I wrote for The Nation magazine back in, probably 2007, 2006. And so it was after I wrote that article, actually, an agent approached me, which was great, and was interested in turning the article into a book. And so I wrote a book proposal, and I sent it to them, and then they said they weren't interested. So I had the book proposal, and I figured, that somebody thought it was a good idea, at least originally. And so then I chopped it around, and I did eventually get that book published. And then this one, again, I've been looking for another book. The Coke Machine came out in 2010, so I've been looking for another book for about a year, and then it was just this chance conversation at a cocktail party when somebody mentioned to me that Forbes Smiley was out of prison that made me put this idea in my head to work on this project.
One of the things that I found was remarkable, and looking through the book, to see the maps, and even in 1495 or 1595 or 1695, these individuals had such a great awareness of the world globe, and they were, if you look at something, you have one in there from 1550 or so, South America is laid out, New England is laid out, there's Cape Cod. It was remarkable that several centuries ago, they were quite aware of the geography of the world. And I wondered if you could just show us a couple of the maps and give us a little thought about what they looked like and how it all developed in terms of map making.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really kind of incredible how just in a very short period of time, these explorers within a generation or two had really explored most of the world. Before I show you some of these maps, first I want to show you a picture of E. Forbes Smiley III, which I just can't say enough. But that's actually him. That's his mugshot, and that's him leaving court during the trial. But this is the map. This is one of the maps he actually had on him the day that he was arrested at Yale. It's a Dutch map from the late 1500s. And if you think about it, Columbus discovered, quote unquote, the New World in 1492. So this is less than 100 years later. And South America is almost completely drawn, and even North America, aside from the Northwest, which they didn't have a good idea of. And they still kept alive the idea that there was a Northwest Passage, of course. One other interesting aspect of this map, is this working? There we go. I just want to show you on the back of this map, this is actually how they were able to definitively show that Smiley had taken this map from the library. There were several wormholes on the back of the map that lined up perfectly with the book that he had been looking at that day. So it was like a cartographic fingerprint, sort of library CSI that nailed him in the end. I brought a few maps of New England to show you as well, because this is the area that we're most familiar with. It was also one of the areas that Smiley specialized in. And this was another map that he had on him that day. It was actually in the pocket of his blazer. It's a map by John Smith, who we know from the story of the Virginia colony, but he actually had sort of a second chapter where he explored New England and actually came up with the term New England as a way to claim it for his home country. And you can see, he explored this area just in an open boat with a sextant, and that was his only means of navigation and cartography. And the detail, aside from some inaccuracies, Cape Anne's a little bit misshapen, but it's really incredible to see just how accurate they were given just the rudimentary materials that they had. This is a map from 1631. This is another map from a few years later. This is another English map by a character by the name of Robert Dudley. And one of the things that really intrigued me about the book was just learning some of the stories about the map makers themselves, which were in some ways just as intriguing as Smiley's story. Dudley was the illegitimate son of an English lord who was rumored to be Queen Elizabeth's lover, and was kicked out of England and fled to Italy, where he sort of started this new career as a map maker. And he was the first map maker to map the entire globe on a Mercator projection, which allows you to sail long distances. And it's this really beautiful work of art. There's a huge tome. It's called the Dell'Arcano del Mare, The Secrets of the Sea. Here's a picture of the Boston Public Library's copy, and you can see on the right there's 3 pages at once were sliced out with a razor blade by Forbes Smiley in 2004 or 2005. So that puts the lie to his claim that he never used a razor blade to cut out a map, and there's other examples as well. This is the last map I'm going to show you. This is about 30 years later, and you can see that now the interior has begun to be mapped. And what's really fascinating about this map, this is by another English map maker named John Seller, and this occurred right in the middle of King Philip's War. And you can see right in the middle of the map, right below the crest, you can make out there's a picture of a group of colonists that are firing into a band of attacking Native Americans. And it was really illustrating, contemporary events at the time. We look at a document like this and we think of it as this kind of old, historic document. But at the time, these artifacts were really being used to tell people about the world that they lived in, and really conveying the latest knowledge about the area. The other thing that's really I really love about this map is that Smiley sold this map to a map collector for about $75,000. And this map collector, there happened to be a map conference up in Maine, and so he wanted to do something special, and so he got Shipyard Brewery to produce a special commemorative beer bottle for the conference of maps. And what better to put on that bottle than a picture of the latest map that he had just acquired from Forbes Smiley. So there it is, and I just love this image of all of these map collectors and dealers sitting around, with their lobster and drinking this beer and not realizing that they're actually holding stolen property in their hands. But it just goes to show you, how in some ways this was really the perfect crime, that a lot of these libraries, they didn't know what they had, they didn't have it cataloged accurately. A number of these maps exist in several copies, so it was really hard to trace them and figure out, the provenance of some of these maps. And in this case, they could be looking right at it and not know that it was stolen. So that just gives you a little bit of flavor. I really felt like we couldn't do a presentation like this without actually showing you some of the maps and some of these beautiful objects that Forbes Smiley stole, but that gives you a little bit of a flavor for what we're talking about here.
Well, one thing that I should mention is, and if you read the book, but Smiley was a successful dealer in the 90s and 2000s. You know, he wasn't this random person who would stumble into these special collections. They knew him, they trusted him. He met with some of the biggest buyers in this country. And so I think that's part of the thing that Michael brought out is, you know, this great betrayal that there was. But you touched on it a moment ago. What about the libraries? I mean, he stole scores of different maps. And how did that happen? I mean, we think people walk around, we think they're vigilant, and some of them do have cameras. How did so many get stolen without an awareness that they were leaving the building?
Yeah, that was one of the really fascinating aspects of the story. You know, people asked me, did he have to sell them on the black market, or, you know, did he have to kind of secret them out? And you know, in some cases, he just walked right out with them. You know, he had a briefcase full of maps that he brought with them, and he would look at maps and you know, slip another map into his briefcase. And because he was so well known and so trusted by these librarians, a lot of times they were none the wiser. And you know, a number of times he actually cut them out of books, like the Dudley map that I showed you. And the card catalog would just for that book would just say maps, or it would just say 3 maps, and it wouldn't tell you which ones they were. And so he was really able to take advantage of that. And you know, it wasn't like it's not like a work of art that you have on the wall, and you know, if the Mona Lisa is missing, there's a blank space there, and everybody knows that it's gone. Some of these books, you know, would go back on the shelf, and they wouldn't even realize that they were missing an object worth $10,000.
We have a great library here, and we have an archive, and I'll be more vigilant in the future as I'm going through. One thing, though, that in your narrative, you did speak with him for a number of moments, 4 hours or longer, and then he decided to cut it off. What were his thoughts about that? He spoke to you once and then didn't want to speak again. And did that affect, you know, your relationship and going forward with the book?
Yeah, I can't tell you his thoughts about that, because once he cut off contact with me, he cut off contact, and I've speculated about why that might be the case. You know, he said that friends and family told him that he was too close to it, and that he couldn't talk about it objectively. But you know, once he talked to me in the first place, and he really did tell me a lot on that first 4-hour interview, I really felt like it was in his interest to keep cooperating, because it just looked like he was trying to hide something. And in fact, you know, as I started uncovering more details, it looks like he was trying to hide some things, and the question is, how much was he trying to hide? But you know, as a writer, that's a really difficult moment, because I had really expected to get a lot of the material for the book from him. He had never talked to the press before. This was kind of the one, you know, the one source that I had that nobody had, and I really wanted to get the story, you know, right from the horse's mouth, as it were. And so I was pretty devastated for a couple of weeks when I got that email and I didn't know what to do. But I'd had this book contract, and you know, it was never a question of not writing the book. So I kind of picked myself up the floor and started making calls. And I will say that there's no question in my mind that it's a better book because he stopped talking to me, because it really forced me to go and explore all these other avenues and talk to as many people as I could, and go to the archives and find documents. And I got lucky with some records from some of the libraries and was able to piece together the story in much more rich detail.
Well, in your appendices at the end, which are significant, you have quite a bit of documentation. You have lists of maps that were recovered, and then you have a very longer list of maps that were not recovered. Is it your sense that there's some still out there, or are authorities looking for them, or the libraries, or is this a very hard thing to track down? Yeah,
this is one of the great mysteries of Forbes Smiley, and one of the great mysteries of the book is just how many maps did he steal. You know, he admitted to stealing about 100 maps, as I said. But the libraries were missing over 100 more, in fact, over 150 more. And a lot of them produced clues, circumstantial clues, about you know, identifying marks and things like that, and were able to claim at least a dozen more maps from collectors and from dealers that they were able to prove that Smiley had never admitted. And the question is, how many more maps are there out there? You know, maybe with a dozen maps, you know, that he could have slipped his mind or not been able to, you know, accurately construct the the trail of the maps that he took, but with another 150 out there. The question is, how many of those did Forbes Smiley steal, and how many of those maybe were just lost from other means or other people stole, and we may never know the answer to that.
Well, from TV, we know the term lawyering up. At any time, did he either say, I'm going to get a lawyer before I speak to you, or after the fact did he show concern and said, look, my lawyer's going to get a hold of you because I don't want this in a book. I spoke to you, you've had a magazine article, I don't want any more. Did he have any legal advice here?
No, he never made any gestures towards that. I think that, here was somebody who was convicted of a crime, admitted he was guilty of a crime, and at that point it was just figuring out the extent of the crime and the details of it. And once he cut off contact with me, I think he was pretty shy of talking at all and just completely cut himself off. So definitely I had lawyers look at the book and make sure that I was on the right side of the law, but it wasn't anything that I was really worried about, at least not in concerning Smiley.
Well, I learned that the map business is quite vibrant, not as large as art, of course, but there are many collectors and many knowledgeable collectors. What does it say about the collectors themselves? I mean, after a while, would they ask him, well, this is John Smith, this is from 1680. Where did you get this? Or do you have provenance on this that I can put on the bottom of it so people will know the documentation of it?
Yeah, it was really interesting for me to go into kind of the subculture of map collecting, which is something that I didn't really know a lot about. And you sort of have this image of this kind of rarefied air of scholars and tweed jackets and glasses in the back rooms of libraries, and it is that to some extent, but it's also a really big business, and there's a lot of money on the table with these things. That Diode map that I showed in the beginning could easily go for $100,000. And there's a lot of competition. There's only so many of these maps out there, and so these dealers are really competing for them, and they're trying to undercut each other at auction, and they're trying to compete with each other on the auction floor. And to some degree, Smiley was a casualty of that. He really couldn't play the game and compete with these other dealers the way that he needed to. And then the libraries, to some extent, point fingers at the dealers for not being more cautious and more aware of some of these, amazing maps that Smiley was bringing to them. And he said that I'm selling off the collection of an old collector up in Boston who's selling off his maps quietly and wants to give money to his kids without paying taxes on it. He had sort of had this whole kind of story about where he got these things, and the dealers that he was dealing with believed it. But after the fact, you could look back and it was just a little too good to be true that he was coming up with all this amazing material just right after each other. Maps that hadn't been on the market for a generation. Suddenly he had two of them.
Well, he was a very flamboyant character, but one of his aspects of his life is he's a terrible manager with money. And you hypothesize that one reason he probably started stealing was, he couldn't keep the business going. He had to do something. And at one time, he went up to central Maine, Sebec, Maine, and bought a house on a lake, and then tried to redo this very small town, and if you know Maine at all, the Mainers do not like people coming in from afar, excuse me, and redoing their town. Can you talk about that? I mean, what was going through his mind to start a little empire up in Maine? Yeah,
he was a fascinating character. There were so many interesting aspects about this book. There was the history of the map making, there was the subculture of map collectors, but at the center, I would say, what really intrigued me was just this character of this person who was so contradictory in so many ways. He really loved maps, and he loved studying maps, but here he was defacing these books with maps. And I think in the end that the way that I look at him is that he just kind of always wanted to be something bigger than what he was. He always wanted to be seen as this jet-setting map dealer who was kind of rubbing elbows with the rich and famous, and he could never quite live up to that image of himself, and he could never quite make ends meet. He was always sort of buying one map, and then immediately he'd sell it and try to buy the other one before he'd sold the first one. And then he sort of created this sort of very quixotic kind of project up in Maine where he decided that he was going to literally restore this entire town, and it was going to be, he's going to put it on the map. Sorry, no pun intended. That was not intentional. But he was going to put it on the map as this tourist destination. This kind of frozen in time New England village, and he poured an enormous amount of money into it. He poured hundreds of thousands of dollars restoring the post office and a restaurant and a general store and employing half the town, and half the people in town thought he was this sort of Robin Hood figure, and he was going to save their fortunes, and the other half, as you say, really resented the fact that he was coming in and telling them what to do with their property. And he started this big feud with this neighbors across the street. His family called the Moriartys, who were sort of, his villain in town, and they got in this huge legal battle, and he just started spending more and more money, and that eventually led to him increasing the pace of his theft. So that whole aspect of the story, once I read about that, once I started looking into that, that's what really convinced me that this was more than a magazine article, that this had to be a book, because you really just can't make this stuff up.
Now, are there questions out there as we move forward? I have a couple more, of course, but other thoughts out there or questions?
Go ahead. There's a parallel case in the Peabody Essex Museum, a curator of China porcelain that was stealing from that collection as well as others, was caught. The FBI raided his apartment, but he claimed he owned everything. And the museums had such poor records, they couldn't, in many cases, prove it, so he retained title to some of the things.
Oh, wow.
Others were returned. Was that a similar case with Smiley, that libraries really couldn't prove that he did in fact own the item?
Yeah, there was, the thefts occurred in 2005, and then there was about a year before the case went to trial, and during that year, there was this kind of treasure hunt going on with the FBI agent trying to figure out who Smiley had sold these maps to and where the maps originally belonged. And all the libraries kind of got all their evidence together, and they got their whatever kind of catalog records they had, but then they also got any kind of digital photos or any kind of imprints on books or smudges or marks or anything that they could show. And in some cases, they went down to this kind of big dramatic meeting at the New Haven FBI office. And in some cases, there were libraries that were fighting with each other. And of course, as I say, they were librarians, so it was a quiet fight. But but they were really pointing fingers. That Dudley map, for example, at a certain point, it wasn't sure whether it was from the Boston Public Library's copy or whether it's the New York Public Library's copy, and there were a number of maps that kind of went back and forth in a bit of a tug of war, and there were a number of maps, as I said, that turned up later that Smiley didn't even admit to taking, that libraries were able to claim. So it was a real mess.
Yes.
So I really have two questions. Did he have to make restitution to some of the people that he sold the stolen maps to? And also, did it change that subculture of map collectors? Are they being more cautious now about checking out the provenance of the maps that they purchase?
Yeah, the question of restitution was really interesting. He, because they could only prove a certain number of maps, he actually wasn't legally required to pay restitution because he had admitted, you can't pay restitution for items that that he came forward that the FBI couldn't prove. But he did actually agree as part of a plea bargain that he was going to make restitution for all the maps that he stole. And I think the final figure was $2.3 million that he owed. And last I knew, he was on the vineyard working as a landscaper for $12 an hour. So do the math. I think some of the dealers joked that they should get his house on the vineyard as a timeshare, during the summer, and maybe they could make it up that way. But I don't think they're going to see any of that money anytime soon. As far as the map community, I do think that this was a big wake-up call for people. I think both for the libraries, I think they changed a lot of their security practices, as well as the dealers. I think there's a lot more emphasis that's put on provenance now and trying to actually figure out where these maps came from, not just one sale back, but 2 or 3 sales back. But as dealers have told me, it's hard with some of the stuff. Maps. dramatically escalated in value in the 80s and 90s, and before that, there wasn't a lot of tracking about where these things were coming from or who was selling them to whom. So it's hard in a lot of cases to track it back more than one sale, and there's only kind of so much care and attention that you can put towards it if you want to be in that business.
Rena?
I'm interested in Mr. Smiley's view of himself as the hero or villain of a book that you wrote. Does he feel, do you know this, does he feel that you have disgraced him by putting all the facts out there for the public to read? Or have you in fact made him by giving him the kind of fame that he may have been lusting after?
It's a good question. Like I say, once he cut himself off and he sent me that email and said, "I'm not going to talk to you," he was really a man of his word, and he has not talked to me since. I sent him a copy of the book a few months before it was published, or a month before it was published, and with the thank you note, and at least for opening himself up to me to the extent that he did. And I can tell you I have heard a little bit through the grapevine, through some of his friends, that he maybe regrets not talking to me more, that he felt like the book was a lot more fair than maybe he was expecting. And that was really my goal with the book, was not to paint him as this kind of demon or this kind of mastermind criminal. I think his story was, in some ways, a really human story, that he was someone who just couldn't quite succeed in the business that he'd chosen, and couldn't quite live up to this image that he'd have of himself, and ended up making this decision, looking at a map on the table in front of him and realizing he could just slip it in his pocket and sell it for $30,000 and pay off a debt. It's really a story about giving into that temptation and then the consequences that come over it. And I feel like that's a story that we can all relate to. We all have temptations in our lives, and we make decisions maybe that we aren't proud of. And in his case, they were just the consequences were quite a bit greater, and the decision he made was really devastating to a lot of these libraries. But no, in terms, I'm still waiting for that phone call or that letter, to have him tell me exactly what he thinks about it. But so far, haven't gotten it.
Well, just to put it in context a little bit, Smiley plea bargained, and he served about 3 years in prison, mostly minimum security, or I think he went to medium after that. But what is your sense of that? 3 years, a lot of maps are still out there. I mean, you're not a parole officer, but what are your thoughts about 3 years for a decade of theft, much of which has never been recovered?
Yeah, it was really interesting to look at the legal arguments on both sides. Of course, the libraries came and they really wanted to see him do serious time as a deterrent to future criminals who might think about doing this. And there was even a split between the federal and the state judge. He went before the state judge and he said, I've got kids that rob a convenience store and do 20 years, and here you've stole $3 million worth of maps, and you're getting 3 years. But on the other side, the prosecutors made the argument that he did cooperate, that he did admit to taking these maps, that the libraries themselves, couldn't even prove that he had taken. And so they wanted to set a precedent on that, and they wanted to show that if you do cooperate with authorities and admit your crime, then you'll get a lighter sentence for it. So I sort of, as a journalist, I can see both sides, and I sort of step back a little bit from answering that question personally. But I will say that 3 years was the minimum he was looking at. He was looking at up to 8 years, and he got the absolute minimum that he could have gotten. And there were a lot of people that were not very happy about that when that judgment came down.
Was there a question here?
Yes. How did so many rare maps end up in books that could be taken from? I mean, I've said copies of maps. Of course, that would be another story, but I take it these were original maps.
Yeah, it's interesting. I learned a lot about the history of map making. In some ways, I could relate to Smiley's obsessions, because I became very obsessive in learning everything I could about the history of map making, and I won't bore everyone. But when a map was drawn, it was then printed on a copper plate, and usually there were about 1,000 copies before the plate wore out. And a lot of these maps, they weren't thinking of them as these documents that would last, for posterity. They were really, as I said, contemporary documents. So they would print them as sheets that would be used, by mariners on ships for navigation, or like that John Smith map, for example, was in a travelogue that he wrote about New England. Called A Description of New England, and it was basically a visual aid to the text in this long book. And a lot of the maps were like that and were bound into these books as visual aids. And then over the years, sometimes they were ripped out because they were used or they were lost or the book was taken apart. And so, it's very hard to track these things and figure out exactly how many there were and exactly, whether they're supposed to be in the book or not supposed to be in the book. And Smiley knew that better than anyone. He was really an expert in this field, and he knew exactly what maps were supposed to be where, much more even than some of the map curators in the libraries that were looking after these things, and he was able to take advantage of that.
Are you saying then that all these maps, or many of them, were really prints?
Right. So there is such a thing as a manuscript map, but those are very rare. Most of those have not survived. So what people collect for the most part are these prints. So when you look at, for example, that John Smith map, it's still an original map that came off the printing press in 1616 or 1631, whenever it was. It's still considered an original, but it is in fact a copy. And there were many copies made at the time, and maybe 1,000 copies were made, and maybe 25 still exist today.
Yes, in the back.
Yeah, I read your book, and I was surprised to find that, I think it was the Boston Public Library, I'm not sure whether I'm correct or not in remembering that did not go after these maps. Am I correct in that? Was it Boston Public Library?
What do you mean did not go after them?
Well, it didn't go after the ones he stole. Didn't want to admit that they had been robbed.
Well, I didn't find that so much in the libraries that were investigated in this case. That has been a feature in other map thefts in the past, where in some cases the libraries won't even divulge the fact that they've been stolen. And in this case, even though the libraries admitted to the FBI, what they didn't do in all cases was go public with it. So they didn't actually go to the newspapers and say, here's the maps that we're missing. And so a lot of people faulted them for that because, if you're trying to recover these things, the best way to do it is to, tell people what you're missing and have people come forward. And in many cases, I think there was a lot of behind the scenes between lawyers and public relations people and librarians, and a lot of arguments that happened. And in a number of cases, they actually didn't go public with it. So, which is a real shame. But at the same time, you can understand, their fears in that they don't want to admit that they're missing items for their collection because they're trying to cultivate donors who are going to put more items into the library. So, you can have sympathy for it, but ultimately it does, impede the chance of getting these things back. So it is a shame.
Did he go international with his adventures?
He did go international to one library in London, the British Library, that he stole. He stole one map that was proven. There were 3 other maps that were attributed to him. But there's people out there who believe that he may have been going all over Europe and getting maps there, but no libraries have come forward aside from the British Library.
Yes.
When you did your interview, did you take notes over those 4 hours, or did he permit you to tape the conversation?
I taped the conversation. Yeah, he did. Like I say, he was very excited to talk to me in the beginning. He really wanted to tell his story. As he described to me, he has a son who was just turned 13 and starting to get old enough to Google, and he wanted a chance to tell his story from his point of view, and it was only
So
afterward.
Google was the reason he
Google, exactly.
Well, there it is.
Thanks to Google.
What?
He should go on a book tour.
Well, as a journalist, I'm always looking for a lead. And the first paragraphs in your book were, you cut to the chase, and this was literally, you set up the moment when he was in the Yale Library. He walked across the room, a razor dropped out of his pocket. And I'm just wondering, you know, as you did your research, and it doesn't all happen at once, when you saw this fact, did you say this is it? Or did it take a moment for you to think that that might be a good way to start it off with some speed?
No, I had all along the idea that that razor blade was going to be, you know, it's right in the first paragraph or the first 3 paragraphs. He drops the blade, and you know that detail. You know, a lot of times as a writer, at least as a nonfiction writer, you try out your material as you're writing it, and you know, that was sort of as I would go and talk to people about the book I was working on, or you know, talk at the proverbial cocktail party, and they you know say, you know, who's this guy Forbes Smiley, you know, immediately once I mentioned that drop razor blade, and particularly the librarian finding it, you know, and really this kind of hero coming in and finding this blade and starting this whole unraveling. I mean, you know, I could just see people's eyes perk up, and I knew that was sort of, you know, that detail was really would really grab people.
I must say the publisher had some fun with the book, because on some of the pages, like for the opening, it's kind of, it looks like it's been slit by a razor. It's dark, it's discolored, and you know, it's probably just, you know, it's a fun moment for the publishers. They probably had a good time. Well, what can we do to jazz it up? Oh yeah, we'll make it look like someone took a flap out of this. So numerous pages are done in that way.
You should see the paperback. They've redesigned the cover for the paperback, which is coming out in a couple of months. And the front cover, it's an optical illusion that looks like all the pages of the book have been cut out in a big square. It says The Map Thief in the middle of it.
So everyone's getting excited. Well,
yeah,
everyone's getting on board. That's a good thing. Yes.
I'm a librarian, so just to say. And one of my favorite classes at the end of my schooling was about the history of the book, and we spent an entire afternoon talking about book thieves and the people that work in this area. So what I wondered is, did the libraries not have any markings on the maps? Like, did you have to physically remove, say, the stamps and the things that libraries do in order to show their ownership? And also I wondered, just because I had heard about this, one of the more kind of notorious thieves to librarians were the people that were book breakers, who would break up the books and cut out pieces of pages rather than keeping the book whole. So especially like illuminated manuscripts, you'd get just the letter, and they'd sell the letter. And I wondered if that was something that happened with maps too, in terms of like, say, the compass or something being sold.
Yeah. First off, I have to say that, you know, nothing I have said should be construed as being critical of librarians, of you know, the fact that they were able to have these things stolen. I mean, just I gained whole new appreciation for librarians in writing this book, and particularly in the openness that they had in talking with me about, you know, what is a pretty unsavory subject in some ways. You know, people pointing the fingers at the libraries for losing this material, and you know, I really, after Smiley stopped talking to me, I really couldn't have written this book had not several librarians come up and really gone through point by point what happened. So. Yeah, librarians. In terms of the maps themselves, though, you know, it was really really interesting. Some of the maps did have, for example, stamps. They would put a stamp on sort of the back of the map or something. But it was pretty rare, because, you know, the last thing that you want to see on a beautiful, you know, John Smith map of New England is a big stamp, you know, that says property of Yale University Library in the middle of it. But Smiley was really good in many cases at removing those marks. So he, you know, he had been a map dealer for 30 years, and part of being a map dealer is restoring maps. And, you know, as you say, book breaking was a big feature of the map trade for many years. So people would take these books, they would rip them up, and they would sell the individual sheets from them, and in some cases they would refurbish them. And so he was very good. Once he had the maps out of the books, he would sometimes bleach the papers, he would cut off margins if they had like page numbers or things like that. In some cases, that last map that I showed you, the John Seller map of New England, the Native Americans that are kind of holding up the crest have green and pink painted clothing, and Smiley actually put that on because Yale's copy of the map was uncolored. So he actually physically went in and colored the maps and actually changed it. So he was really good at what he did, and he was able to obscure a lot of these markings, and in some cases, the libraries weren't able to put the maps back into the original books, which is a real shame. As a in terms of the historical record, a lot of what you can tell about these books, there's all kinds of information in the quality of the paper and the way that it's bound into the book and all of that, which is just completely ruined by the way that he treated them. So it really is a shame. In terms of your other question about selling the individual parts of the maps, I haven't seen a lot of that being done. I mean, the maps themselves were taken out of books and sold as individual sheets. But in terms of cutting out compass roses or anything like that, I haven't seen that being done. But it's interesting. For a long time, the maps were actually worth more outside of the books, and now it's gone completely the opposite way in the trade because so many of these precious books have been broken up back in the 1950s or 60s when people weren't, they weren't worth as much money. Now it's the complete opposite. To find an intact atlas with all the maps in it is worth much more than the individual book. So hopefully that'll deter more of that from happening.
Yes.
Yeah, so I haven't read your book yet. So forgive me for the question. But so what was his story? So for 30 years he was a map collector, but like who was he before that? Like was his father not nice to him? Like did he grow up? Did he have siblings?
Always the father.
Yeah, he was, like I say, he was a fascinating character, and he was fascinating from early on. In high school, he sort of had this kind of magnetic quality on people. He was very bookish, when he was a kid, and he was also quite overweight. And to compensate for that, he became very charming, and he was always sort of he was always kind of the life of the party, and always kind of had these friends around him. And he would learn, he knew everything about everything. He was always kind of the smartest person in the room. And then he would do, physically he was very gifted as well, so he was very good with his hands, which came in, came in very helpful later when he was ripping maps out of books. But he could do these juggling tricks, and he could do that trick with the knife where you go really quick around your fingers. He could whittle, and so he had this whole group of friends in high school and college who remained loyal to him for many years afterwards, and would tell me, about this. How much of an influence he had on him, and how special a person he was, and like I say, I think that he really cultivated. He had, I don't know what his insecurity was, but he had some insecurity that really caused him to cultivate this image of himself. He always wanted to be kind of this caretaker. He wanted to have this village up in Maine that he was sort of the lord of the manor and sort of could take care of everybody in town. And it was real. If there was sort of a Greek flaw, a character flaw, I think that was it. That he just he couldn't deal with the fact that he hadn't lived up to his own image of himself, and the only way that he saw to get out of that was to steal. And
you spoke to numerous friends of his. He'd known them for 2 decades or more. What was their take on it? Did they feel betrayed, or were they supportive of him? Or when this all came out, it's beyond just a friend mucking up. He ruined art. He went to jail for it. How valuable were the friends in adding to your story, and what was their reaction when this all unraveled?
Yeah, they were hugely valuable, and particularly one friend of his that even after Forbes stopped talking to me, he kept talking to me, and because he really felt like he wanted the book to reflect this person that he'd known all of those years, and not be a caricature, and it really enabled me to draw a deeper portrait of him. And what was interesting was to see the reactions of his friends, because it really went both ways. Some of his friends felt almost personally betrayed, that here's this kind of larger-than-life figure. They would go up to Maine for the summers, and he would hold these, parties with, he would cook, and they'd have beer and scotch late into the night, and he'd pay for everything, and he'd, peeling off these $100 bills, at the restaurants, and so they felt really personally betrayed that this person that they thought that they knew and that they looked up to and that they respected turned out to be a fraud in some ways. And then others of his friends, including the one who I really became close with over the writing of the book, had the complete opposite reaction, that were almost relieved in a way to see that he wasn't what he seemed, and that he was very human at the core of it, and that when he did crash and burn and kind of had to admit his shortcomings and to take responsibility for this really horrible things that he had done, they stuck by him, and in some ways they said that deepened their friendship with him, because it really kind of put him on everybody else's level. He couldn't be kind of the lord of the manor anymore. So it was really, really fascinating to see those kind of different reactions that people had.
Well, now I think I do have to say we're only going to take one or two more questions. One of them, and if you have one, please frame it, but you're with Brandeis University. You're helping the investigative reporting studies there. Talk a little about that, and was Brandeis helpful in moving this manuscript along?
Yeah, they were enormously helpful. I'm a fellow at, it's called the Schuster Institute for Investigative Journalism at Brandeis University. And investigative journalism now is, it's really at a crisis level. I mean, newspapers have just totally cut back on their investigative departments, and so journalists like myself really have to struggle to find the resources to be able to do the in-depth reporting. I mean, this book took me 3 years to report. What they do is provide students who provide research support. And so they get the experience of working with a journalist and learning something from that, and then myself and the other fellows get the assistance of these student journalists who are really dogged and tenacious, and don't mind doing the grunt work of transcribing the interviews, but can also go and look at public documents. So yeah, it was really enormously helpful.
Is there yes?
You mentioned that there are possibly 150 other maps still missing. So it seems to me that it's likely that there are other people who are doing the same sort of thing. Did you encounter any evidence about others who are also slicing maps out of books?
Yeah. One of the reasons why I included the appendixes that I did was because I'm hoping that my book will help to recover some of these maps. That just having that list out there may be collectors who read my book and realize that they've got some of these maps in their collections and maybe make a few phone calls. But I went through to report the book. I didn't have to go to every library and look at every map, but again, maybe this is my own obsessiveness coming out, but I went and actually did that. I went and requested every single map that he stole, and I did find some discrepancies in terms of maps that he had admitted taking, maps that the FBI had on their list of maps that were stolen, and the maps that were actually there. Sometimes there were maps there that were supposed to be missing, and vice versa. And I also have to say, just as an aside, part of the pleasure of writing this book was just being able to hold so many of these maps and actually go. And you can actually do that. You can go to any of these libraries, and even today, even given these security concerns, the libraries take their mission of access very, very seriously. And you can go, and there's just this materialism of holding these maps and looking at them in your hands. Was really one of the pleasures of writing the book. But in terms of other map thieves, there's certainly a number of them who have been caught over the years. That none of them quite at the level of Smiley, but in past years there are other map thieves that have come forward, and other book and print thieves as well that have come forward. But it's one of those things that you don't know the dog that doesn't bark, unless somebody's actually caught with one of these things, or there's a razor blade on the floor. It's hard to tell, But yeah, I have no doubt that there's other people out there that probably have gotten away with this and probably are remaining to be caught.
There was another, yes.
What's up next? What are you working on?
That's the question I always dread in forums like this, because I'm in search of a project. Much to my agent and my publisher's chagrin, I haven't found that great narrative that I can sink my teeth into for 3 years. So if anybody's got any ideas, please feel free to contact me afterwards.
Well, this has been great, and I want to thank Michael for coming. And he'll be in the lobby right after this, and there are a number of books there. He will sign them. And I just think this has been so interesting, and it's history, it's nonfiction, and thank you for coming, Michael.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure to be here.